The smell of fresh-cut cedar always had a way of grounding me. It's a scent that carries the weight of hard work and the promise of a fresh start. For 3 long, grueling summers, I spent every waking hour outside my 9-to-5 job, sweating over these beams, hauling timber, and driving every single galvanized nail into the frame of this sanctuary. I chose this spot on the edge of Bluegill Lake because the water is so still it looks like a mirror, reflecting the towering white pines in the endless Montana sky. I didn't just build a house, I built a fortress for Sarah and me, a place where the noise of the city, the stress of our careers, and the prying eyes of the world couldn't reach us. I thought that by building these walls with my own calloused hands, I was securing our future. And I didn't know then that the very walls I raised would eventually echo with the hollow sound of my life falling apart. I didn't know that the floorboards I sanded until they were smooth as silk would soon creak under the weight of a betrayal I never saw coming. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. My name is Miller. I've always been a man who trusts the math. If the foundation is level and the joints are tight, the structure will hold. But human hearts don't follow the laws of physics. Loyalty is a tricky thing in the dark. It looks exactly like a shadow until the sun finally goes down and you realize there's nothing actually there. And this is the story of how my greatest achievement became the stage for my greatest heartbreak, and how I had to decide whether to burn it all down or find a way to make the truth come to light. It started on a Tuesday, a day so ordinary it should have been a warning. Sarah was scrolling through her phone over dinner, a habit that had become more frequent lately, when she let out a long theatrical sigh. She looked up at me with those green eyes that I used to think held all the answers. "Miller," she said, her voice soft and persuasive. "Do you remember Julian? From college? He was in my honors lit class. We used to spend hours in the campus library debating Russian literature." I remember Julian. He was the guy who always seemed to be around during our early dating years, the platonic shadow that never quite faded into the background. He was the guy who laughed a little too loudly at her jokes and had a way of standing just a few inches too close when they spoke. He was a high-level marketing executive in Chicago, or at least he used to be. Sarah explained that he was going through a total collapse, a messy divorce, a corporate restructuring that left him jobless, and a sudden bout of existential dread. She told me he needed the mountain air. She said he needed a place to reset away from the city lights and the lawyers. I felt a twinge of hesitation in my chest. This cabin was our place. It was private. But Sarah knew my weakness. I'm a fixer. I build things and I fix things. "He's in a dark place." "Abe Miller," she whispered, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "If we have the space, shouldn't we help?" I looked at her, seeing the wife I loved, and ignored the knot forming in my stomach. I agreed. It was the first crack in the foundation, a tiny fissure I thought I could just patch over with a little bit of hospitality. The drive from the city to Bluegill Lake is a 4-hour journey through winding back roads, past abandoned barns and thinning cell service. Usually this drive was my favorite part of the month. Sarah and I would turn off our phones, listen to old folk records, and talk about the garden we wanted to plant behind the tool shed. But this time, the atmosphere was suffocating. Julian was in the back seat, surrounded by expensive, monogrammed leather luggage that looked absurd against the rugged interior of my Ford F-150. He didn't stop talking for 300 miles. He talked about his severance package, his ex-wife's unreasonable demands, and the craft cocktail scene in the West Loop. Every time I tried to steer the conversation toward the local wildlife or the technical specs of the solar grid I'd just installed at the cabin, he'd pivot back to himself. "That's fascinating, Miller," he'd say with a smirk I could see in the rearview mirror. "But did I tell you about the time Sarah and I got stuck in that blizzard in O'Hare? We had to share a single blanket for 12 hours. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Every time I glanced back, I didn't see a broken man in need of healing. And I saw a man watching the back of my wife's head with a proprietary intensity. And Sarah? She was leaning back, her hair catching the afternoon sun, laughing at stories I hadn't been a part of. I felt like a chauffeur in my own life, When we finally crested the last hill and the cabin came into view, the sun was dipping below the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burning orange. The cabin stood there, a testament to my labor, its cedar siding glowing in the twilight. I felt a familiar swell of pride as I pulled into the gravel drive. I'd hand-carved the front door from a single slab of white oak, etching a small leaf pattern into the corner to represent the roots we were planting. But the moment the engine died, the piece was shattered. Julian hopped out of the truck before I could even set the parking brake. He didn't wait for a tour. He walked straight up to the porch, put his hand on the small of Sarah's back to guide her up the steps, and started commenting on the quaintness of the architecture. "It's so rustic, Miller," he called out over his shoulder, his voice dripping with a patronizing tone. "A real man-of-the-woods vibe. Does it have actual plumbing, or are we living like the pioneers?" He acted like he was the host welcoming me to my own property. As I hauled his heavy bags up the stairs, my muscles aching from the drive and the tension, I realized that I hadn't just invited a guest into my home. I had invited an intruder who had no respect for the blood and sweat I'd poured into these timbers. That first night, when the fire was roaring in the stone hearth I'd spent 6 weeks laying, stone by painstaking stone. I'd picked each rock from the creek bed myself, looking for the flat ones that would stack perfectly without too much mortar. I was at the grill on the deck, searing steaks over charcoal, trying to reclaim my sense of purpose. Through the large glass windows I watched them. They were in the kitchen, opening a bottle of Cabernet, a bottle I'd been saving for our 10th anniversary. Sarah was glowing. She was animated, her hands moving through the air as she told a story, her laughter ringing out and hitting me like a physical blow. Julian was leaning against the counter, swirling his wine, looking at her with an expression that was anything but friendly. When I finally brought the food in, the conversation died for a split second before Julian launched into a story about a trip they took to Cabo San Lucas during their junior year of college. A trip I hadn't known about. He talked about the secret beaches and the tequila sunrises. I sat at the head of the table, cutting into my steak, feeling the cold mountain air seeping through the floorboards I thought I'd sealed perfectly. Every shared glance between them was a termite eating at the structural integrity of my marriage. I've always been a light sleeper, a side effect of growing up in a house that always needed repairs. You learn to listen for the drips, the groans, and the shifts. At 2 a.m., I woke up to a silence so profound it felt heavy. The fire had died down to a dull orange glow in the living room. I got up to get a glass of water, walking my bare feet silent on the wood. As I passed the guest wing, I noticed the door to Julian's room was cracked open, a sliver of moonlight spilling into the hallway. I stopped. I shouldn't have looked, but the intuition of a builder told me something was out of alignment. Through the gap, I saw Sarah. She was sitting on the edge of Julian's bed. They weren't touching, not yet, but they were whispering in a way that felt more intimate than a physical act. Her silhouette was hunched toward him, and his hand was resting on the mattress just inches from her thigh. "He'll never understand," I heard Julian whisper. Sarah let out a long, shaky breath. "He's just so focused on the house." The air in the hallway felt thin. I stood there in the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs, while realizing that the sanctuary I built was being desecrated from the inside out. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I just went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. The next morning was a masterclass in deception. I walked into the kitchen to find Sarah making blueberry pancakes, the smell of bacon filling the air as if nothing had happened. Julian was out on the deck, wearing a fresh linen shirt, doing some sort of yoga stretch against the railing I'd built to keep people from falling 50 feet into the ravine. "Sleep well, Miller?" he asked, his voice bright and mocking. "Like a log," I lied. I watched Sarah flip a pancake. Her hand was steady, her smile was bright. I wondered how long she had been practicing this version of herself. I decided then that I wouldn't play the role of the suspicious husband. I would play the role of the provider. I suggested that Julian and I head down to the lake to prep the dock for the season. I told them the winter ice had shifted some of the pilings, and I needed a second pair of hands. I wanted to get Julian away from the cabin. I wanted to see the man in the light of day, without Sarah there to soften his edges. I needed to see if the city boy had any steel in his spine. Down at the water's edge, the morning mist was still clinging to the surface of Bluegill Lake. The air was sharp and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Julian stood on the dock, looking down at his expensive loafers as if the mud were an insult. I was in my waders, hip deep in the freezing water, checking the bolts on the underwater supports. "You've got a good life here, Miller," Julian said, his voice echoing off the water. And he wasn't looking at me. He was looking back up at the cabin where Sarah was visible through the window. "Almost too good for a guy who spends his time worrying about pilings and joists." I paused, a wrench in my hand, the cold water numbing my legs. I asked him what he meant by that. He let out a short, jagged laugh. Sarah always had a taste for the authentic during college. She liked the rough edges. But eventually, people like her crave the city. They crave someone who understands the subtext, not just the structure. "You're the foundation, Miller, but I'm the view." He looked down at me then, his eyes cold and predatory. I didn't snap. I just tightened the bolt until the metal groaned. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. Hey, does Julian sound like a friend in need or a wolf in the fold? I'm a man of systems. When I built the cabin, I was worried about the local black bears and the occasional mountain lion that wandered down from the high country. To protect my investment, I'd installed a high-end, discreet security system. It was a network of trail cams hidden in the knots of trees and a few internal cameras disguised as smoke detectors and smart home hubs. I'd told Sarah about them when we first moved in, but she'd clearly forgotten. That afternoon, while the two of them went for a nature walk to look at the wildflowers, I didn't go with them. I told them I had a leak in the tool shed to look at. I sat on a crate in the dim light of the shed, my tablet in my hand, and opened the cloud server. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to see it, but I had to know if the foundation of my marriage was as rotten as I suspected. I scrolled back through the footage from the night before, and then I turned on the live feed. I sat in that dark space, surrounded by the smell of gasoline and sawdust, waiting for the truth to reveal itself in high definition. The screen flickered, the high-definition lens capturing the mudroom, the small space where we kept our hiking boots and rain gear. They hadn't gone for a walk. They had circled back the moment they thought I was occupied. The footage showed them pressed against the cedar wall, the wall I had spent hours staining to a perfect mahogany. Julian's hands were everywhere. And Sarah. She wasn't pushing him away. She was pulling him closer. I watched as she whispered into his ear. Her face contorted with a passion I hadn't seen directed at me in 3 years. The audio was crystal clear. "He's so oblivious," Julian whispered, his voice dripping with contempt. "He thinks he can build a world and just keep you in it." Sarah laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "He builds houses, Julian. He doesn't know how to build a life." I sat in that shed and felt my soul leave my body. I watched my world dissolve in 1080p. Every word they spoke was a hammer blow to the structure of my life. The heat of anger is dangerous. It makes you sloppy. I've seen builders rush a job because they were behind schedule, only for the whole thing to collapse under the first heavy snow. I took a deep breath, forcing the cold mountain air into my lungs. I didn't storm out there. I didn't grab the hunting rifle from the rack. And I remembered the channel name, Family Secrets and Revenge. I realized that a man who knows how to put a house together knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are. He knows which screw to turn to make the whole thing groan. I realized I didn't want a scene. I wanted a reckoning. I spent the next hour meticulously downloading the footage to 3 different cloud drives. I checked the weather report. A massive front was moving in from the west, a clipper that would bring heavy rain and flash floods to the valley roads. I walked back to the cabin, wiped the dirt from my boots, and sat at the kitchen table. I waited. I was no longer the builder. I was the architect of their downfall. By 5 p.m., the sky had turned a sickly shade of charcoal. The wind began to howl through the pines, a sound like 1,000 whispers. Sarah and Julian returned, flushed and smiling, claiming they'd seen a deer near the creek. I played the part of the doting husband. I offered them drinks. I suggested we start a fire. The power went out around 6:30 p.m., just as the first heavy drops of rain began to hammer against the tin roof. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic drumming that made conversation difficult. We sat in the living room, illuminated by the flickering amber light of the candles I'd placed on the mantel. Julian was sitting on the sofa, uncomfortably close to Sarah, acting like her protector. I sat in my hand-built rocking chair in the corner, the shadows hiding my face. I started to talk. I didn't talk about the weather. I talked about the house. I talked about how, when you build in the mountains, what you have to account for the creep, the way the earth moves and tries to reclaim what you've taken. You know, I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the sound of the rain. I reinforced the cellar last year. I used 3/4-inch rebar and high-strength concrete. It's the only part of this house that's truly indestructible. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Why are you talking about the cellar, Miller? You're acting so strange, she asked, her voice tight and defensive. I leaned forward, the candlelight catching the edges of my tablet, which I held in my lap. Because when things get heavy, you need to know where the solid ground is. You need to know who you can trust when the storm hits. I looked at Julian. You talk a lot about the city, Julian, about subtext and excitement. But out here, there is no subtext. There's just the wind, the rain, and the truth. Julian tried to laugh it off, but his eyes were darting toward the door. The storm was at its peak now, the house shaking under the force of the wind, the timbers groaning as if they were screaming for the truth to be told. I didn't wait for him to respond. I simply turned the tablet around and set it on the coffee table between them. I hit play. The volume was up to the max. The sound of their voices in the mudroom filled the room, competing with the thunder outside. He's so oblivious. He builds houses. He doesn't know how to build a life. The silence that followed inside the room was more violent than the storm outside. Sarah's face went a ghostly shade of white, her mouth hanging open. Julian's bravado vanished instantly. He looked like a cornered rat, his eyes wide and panicked. He started to stammer, something about context, and it's not what it looks like, but the video didn't lie. I just sat there, rocking slowly in my chair, watching them realize that the man they thought was a simple builder had been watching them the entire time. Every second of that video was a lash across their dignity. The road out of here is about to wash out, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. In about 10 minutes, the bridge over the lower creek will be underwater. If you leave now, you might make it to the highway. If you stay, you'll be trapped here with me for 3 days. Julian looked at the window, where the rain was coming down in sheets so thick you couldn't see the porch railing. You can't be serious, he whispered. It's a hurricane out there. My car won't make it. I stood up then, numb, and for the first time, I let them see the man who had spent 3 years hauling stone and timber. I stood a head taller than Julian, and my hands were twice the size of his. You have 10 minutes to get your leather bags into your car and get off my property, I said. Sarah tried to scream, calling me a monster, telling me I was going to kill him. I didn't even look at her. I just pointed at the door, my eyes as cold as the lake water in January. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in my story and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have kicked him out into the storm or waited for morning? I stood on the porch, protected by the overhang, and watched as Julian struggled to load his luggage into his sedan. He was drenched in seconds, his expensive clothes clinging to his frame, his loafers ruined by the mud. He looked pathetic. He couldn't even get the trunk to close properly in the wind. Sarah stood in the doorway, sobbing, torn between the man she had betrayed and the comfort of the house I'd built. Miller, please, this was just a mistake, she cried. It was a mistake. We were just lonely. I turned to her then, the rain spraying onto my face. You weren't lonely, Sarah. You were bored, and you thought my hard work was a sign of weakness? I told her that if she wanted to be with a man of subtext, she should go help him with his bags. She didn't move. She watched as Julian's taillights disappeared into the gray wall of the storm, fishtailing as he hit the gravel drive. He didn't even look back for her. He was gone. The next few weeks were a blur of legal documents and silence. I stayed at the cabin. I needed to be there to reclaim it. I spent hours scrubbing every surface, as if I could wash away the memory of their presence. I realized that Sarah had never really seen the cabin. She saw a backdrop for her life, a rustic vibe to show off to her friends. She never saw the sweat in the grain of the wood or the sacrifice in the stone. The divorce was surprisingly quick. When her lawyers saw the footage, they stopped fighting for the property. I kept the cabin. I kept the lake. I kept my dignity. But the silence in the evenings was different now. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a structure that had been hollowed out. I had to decide if I was going to sell it or if I was going to finish what I started. I chose to stay. I'm sitting on the porch now, looking out at Bluegill Lake. The water is still, and the mountains are capped with the first dusting of autumn snow. I've realized that a house is just a shell. It's the integrity of the people inside that makes it a home. I lost a wife, and I lost a version of my life that was built on a lie. But in the process, I found the man I was meant to be. I still smell the cedar every morning, but now it doesn't remind me of a fresh start with her. It reminds me of my own strength. I am Miller, and I know how to build things that last. And I know how to tear down the things that don't deserve to stand. Thank you so much for joining me for this story. It's never easy to talk about the moment your life changes forever, but sharing it with you all makes the burden a little lighter. If this story moved you, or if you've ever dealt with a best friend who wasn't what they seem, please hit that like button and subscribe to Family Secrets and Revenge. Your support means the world to me. Don't forget to leave a comment with your overall thoughts on my journey. I'll be down there responding to as many as I can. Until next time, keep your secrets close and your eyes open.